So I know that there's a lot of kids that are listening to that, and they're like, their question is, but should I still stretch? Should I still stretch the hip flexors? What are your thoughts there?
I don't think stretching is necessarily bad. I think stretching can get a bad rep, but I don't think that it is necessarily the most optimal way for many people to go about addressing muscle length. There's a lot of data out there that is very conflicting with static stretching in particular. We can talk about dynamic stretching as well, but with static stretching, there's a lot of data that suggests that the adaptations that occur in the muscle are not actually lengthening the muscle. What we're really doing is increasing the tolerance of the muscle to actually stretch. And that's not doing what most people think a stretch is doing. It's like, oh, I'm so much more flexible. Like, no, you just improved your muscle's ability to go into an orientation where it can handle that stretch. But that does not mean that when you stand up, that hip flexor is going to be in a longer orientation. Now, that doesn't mean it's not helpful, because you are technically reducing the tone within that muscle. But that doesn't mean that that muscle is going to be elongated. In fact, a lot of the studies suggest that it's not even more for 5 or 20 minutes. And then it just goes back to what it was. Because of course it is. Because muscles are secondary to skeletal position, as we mentioned. So what we would probably want to think about instead is, what can I do to facilitate a longer muscle length with potentially the muscle on the other side of the joint? And we can take the hamstrings, for example. So let's go back to that idea of taking a hamstring and shortening it. And then what is the muscle on the other side of the joint, the hip flexor, going to have to do in that instance?
It's going to have to lengthen.
It's going to have to lengthen. So we would probably want to think more along those lines. And I don't think stretching is like I said, it's not a bad tool. I think it's a tool. But if we want to have longer lasting interventions, we should start to think about what skeletal positions do we need to put ourselves in. So a posterior pelvic tilt, tucking your hips in this instance, in that 90-90 hip lift, or a position that facilitates your hips to extend, which would be the opposite of hip flexion, utilizing the muscles that extend your hip. And then if you can breathe through that on top of it, then you're also going to be taking care of other influences like your rib cage position. Because if your ribs are super flared, then that's going to push you into hip flexion, so you can get those obliques on as well. Then that's going to help facilitate that a little bit better, and in my opinion, will result in longer lasting outcomes.
Right. So if the muscle is short, it may not be optimal to strengthen it, but it may not hurt. If the muscle is over lengthened, so like the hamstrings when we're in this pattern, is that going to hurt it? Or is it still the same scenario? You're not going to do any harm, but it's not also not the best.
So I think that's actually a really good point and topic we should probably hit, of this idea, going back to the fact that just because a muscle is short does not mean it is strong. I think, and I'm of the opinion that if we were to actually train those muscles, let's take that short hip flexor, through a elongated position back to a shortened position again, through a full range of motion, I would bet you that would probably do more for people's tight hip flexors than constantly stretching, because at least and then you're getting that eccentric tolerance of the hip flexor. You're getting the ability for the muscle to elongate, which is going to allow it to stretch. And then if you can keep a degree of control over your pelvis when you do that, and then when it contracts, it's going to go through its full arc, which is exactly what that muscle would want to do when you're sprinting, when you're running, when you're jumping, and all of that good stuff. So the opposite, if we were to think about the hamstrings, for example, if I have a chronically elongated muscle, then I would probably, at least for a little while, want to avoid very eccentric, elongated focus in my exercise. So for example, a Romanian deadlift, which has a long hamstring moment, which is going to put a lot of eccentric stress on the hamstring. I probably wouldn't program 10 sets of those in one workout. But I might want to think about doing things like TRX hamstring curls, slider hamstring curls, where I can maintain control over my pelvis and train it concentrically in more of a shortened state. And this doesn't have to be something that we do for 3 months. Maybe it's just for a little while to give your hamstring an ability to contract from an elongated state. Then we can start adding in that other stuff. But I think also a lot of people can go and they can do lots of RDLs, they can do all this stuff, and sometimes they won't have any issues. And I think it depends on the individual. It depends on your limitations and what your sport is and what your demands are and how injury prone you are. If you don't have any issues, like we were just talking earlier, there's a lot of athletes out there that just don't have any issues. And I would assess this person and say, hey, you don't check out 100% great biomechanically, yet you've never been injured in your life. And I think there's something to appreciate and respect about that.
Right. Definitely.